The sound was not of wood breaking, but of a living thing screaming. It started as a low, grinding moan deep within the bowels of the ship, a vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into the soles of the men's boots, freezing them in place. Then came the snap, violent and sharp like a gunshot, echoing across the frozen white wasteland of the Weddell Sea. In the pitch-black Antarctic night of October 1915, the ice was finally finishing what it had started months ago. It was crushing the Endurance. Sir Ernest Shackleton stood on the heaving deck, his breath pluming in the air that was cold enough to crack stone. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury these 27 men could not afford, not when they were thousands of miles from the nearest human settlement, with no radio transmitter to scream for help and no map that could tell them how to walk out of hell. The ship, a three-masted barkentine built of massive Norwegian fir and oak, designed specifically to withstand the crushing pressure of the polar pack, was buckling. The ice floes, driven by unseen currents and the relentless pressure of the Weddell Gyre, were closing in like the walls of a trash compactor. Great shards of ice, some weighing tons, were being thrust up against the hull, climbing the sides of the ship like white demons trying to board. The beams groaned, the deck planks bowed upward, the rigging snapped and whipped in the wind. Inside the ship, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The men, a motley crew of sailors, scientists, and photographers, were scrambling to salvage what they could. Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command, was barking orders, his voice steady despite the terrifying cacophony of the dying ship. They grabbed sleeping bags, boxes of matches, tins of pemmican, and the precious glass photographic plates that Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, had painstakingly captured. The dogs, 69 of them housed in makeshift kennels on the ice beside the ship, were howling, sensing the death of their sanctuary. They knew, perhaps better than the men, that the great wooden beast that had been their home was in its death throes. Shackleton watched it all with a heavy heart. This was supposed to be the last great journey of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. They were meant to cross the Antarctic continent on foot, a feat never before accomplished. Instead, they had never even touched land. The ice had trapped them in January, months ago, freezing around the ship and holding it fast as the winter set in. They had drifted helplessly northward with the pack, imprisoned in a floating white jail. They had played soccer on the ice, put on theatrical shows in the hold, and toasted to the king, hoping that the spring thaw would release them. But the spring had brought not release, but pressure. The ice had turned aggressive. And now the Endurance, the strongest wooden ship ever built for the polar seas, was being turned into matchwood. "She's going, boss," Worsley, the captain, said quietly, standing beside Shackleton. Worsley was a man of immense skill, a navigator who could find a speck of land in a boundless ocean, but against the crushing force of millions of tons of ice, he was powerless. Shackleton nodded, his face a mask of absolute determination. He knew that the moment the ship went under, their mission would instantly change. They were no longer explorers seeking glory, they were desperate men fighting for survival. The goal was no longer the crossing of a continent, it was simply to stay alive. "Get the men off," Shackleton said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Everything onto the ice, we camp on the floe tonight." Abandoning ship in the middle of the ocean is terrifying enough. Abandoning ship onto a shifting, cracking sheet of ice in the middle of the Antarctic darkness is a nightmare beyond comprehension. The men moved with frantic efficiency. They lowered the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, onto the jagged surface of the floe. They dragged out crates of food, tents, and sleeping bags. The ship groaned again, a terrible, tearing sound as the ice drove a massive spear through the hull. Water began to pour into the hold, freezing almost as soon as it touched the frigid air inside. The lights flickered and died as the water reached the dynamo. The Endurance was now a dark, dying silhouette against the stars. That first night on the ice was a baptism of fear. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The men huddled in their flimsy linen tents, listening to the death rattle of their ship a few hundred yards away. The ice beneath them was not solid land, it was a restless skin over an abyss of black water 2 miles deep. Every so often, a crack would sound like a cannon blast, and the floe would shudder, threatening to split beneath their sleeping bags. They were castaways in a world that was actively trying to kill them. There was no vegetation, no shelter, no animals to hunt but the occasional seal or penguin, and winter was still clinging to the world with iron claws. Shackleton did not sleep. He paced the ice, watching the ship, watching the men. He knew that the physical cold was dangerous, but the psychological cold, the creeping despair, was the true enemy. If the men lost hope, they would die. He had to be their fire. He had to project an air of absolute confidence, even though inside he was wrestling with the crushing weight of responsibility. He had brought these men here. He had promised them adventure and glory. Now he had to promise them life. He gathered them the next morning, the pale sun barely cresting the horizon, illuminating a landscape of utter desolation. The Endurance was a wreck, her stern lifted high in the air, her bow crushed and submerged. It was a heartbreaking sight, the destruction of their home, their fortress.
"Ship and stores have gone," Shackleton told them, his blue eyes scanning their tired, soot-stained faces. "So now we'll go home." It was a simple statement, absurd in its optimism, but it was exactly what they needed to hear. He didn't speak of the thousands of miles of ocean between them and safety. He didn't speak of the fact that their radio was silent and the world thought they were dead. He simply stated the new objective: home. The plan was insane. They would drag the 3 heavy lifeboats, loaded with tons of supplies, across the jagged, hummocked surface of the ice floes toward the open water, hundreds of miles away. Once they hit the water, they would sail to the nearest land. It sounded impossible because it was. The ice was not a smooth skating rink. It was a chaotic jumble of pressure ridges, some as high as houses, soft snow that swallowed a man to his waist, and treacherous leads of open water that could open up and swallow a sledge whole. They began the march on October 30th. It was a hellish labor. The men were harnessed to the heavy sledges like draft animals. They strained and sweated in the freezing air, their breath freezing on their beards until their faces were masks of ice. They would heave a boat over a ridge of ice, slipping and cursing, only to find another ridge waiting 50 yards ahead. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. After days of back-breaking effort, they had barely moved from the site of the wreck. The drift of the ice was carrying them backward faster than they could walk forward. It was futile. Shackleton, realizing the madness of burning their precious calories for no gain, called a halt. They would set up camp on a large, stable floe and wait. They would let the drift of the ice take them north, hoping it would eventually deposit them near the edge of the pack, where they could launch the boats. They called it Ocean Camp. It became a monotonous, terrifying routine. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. They lived on a diet of seal meat and blubber. Fuel was scarce, so they burned blubber in makeshift stoves, the thick, oily smoke turning their skin and clothes black. They became greasy, ragged scarecrows, smelling of blood and smoke. But Shackleton kept them busy. He organized soccer games on the ice. He encouraged Hurley to give lantern slide shows. He walked among the tents every night, checking on the men, cracking jokes, settling disputes. He gave up his own mittens to a shivering photographer. He slept less than anyone else. He was watching the ice, always watching. The ice was a fickle host. It carried them north, yes, but it was slowly disintegrating. As the summer approached, the warmer weather began to rot the floes. The solid sheet they were camping on began to crack. One night, a crack opened up right through the middle of a tent. A sailor fell into the water, thrashing in his sleeping bag. Shackleton, reacting with the speed of a cat, reached down and hauled the man and his sodden bag out of the freezing brine, just seconds before the 2 halves of the ice floe slammed back together with a force that would have crushed the man to a pulp. It was a stark reminder. They were living on a time bomb. By April 1916, their floe had shrunk dangerously. It was no longer a vast field. It was a raft dissolving beneath their feet. The open ocean was visible now,
a dark, swelling menace on the horizon. The swell of the Atlantic was rolling under the pack, lifting and breaking the ice. It was time to launch. On April 9th, the decision was made for them. Their floe split in two. They scrambled into the three small boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, and pushed off into the narrow, slush-filled leads of water. This was the beginning of the second act of their nightmare. They were now at the mercy of the sea. These were open boats, barely 20 feet long, crowded with men and gear. They had little protection from the elements. The spray froze on their clothes, turning them into suits of armor. The waves, cold and heavy, broke over the gunwales, soaking them constantly. They had to bail furiously to keep from sinking. At night, they would try to pull the boats onto a piece of floating ice to sleep, but the ice was often too small or rocking too violently. Sometimes they had to sit in the boats all night, huddled together for warmth, drifting in the darkness, listening to the killer whales blowing nearby. The currents were erratic. They were aiming for Elephant Island, a desolate, uninhabited rock far to the north. It was a desperate target, a needle in a haystack, but it was the only solid ground within reach. For 7 days they fought the ocean. They suffered from thirst as the salt spray contaminated their fresh water. Their tongues swelled in their mouths so much they could barely speak. Frostbite turned toes and fingers black. They were hallucinating, seeing houses and trees where there were only gray waves. But Worsley, navigating with a small sextant and a pocket chronometer, bracing himself against the mast as the boat pitched wildly, performed miracles. He guided them through the shifting fogs and storms. On the 7th day, a jagged shape loomed out of the mist. Land. Elephant Island. It was grim, forbidding, sheer cliffs rising straight out of the boiling surf. But to these men, it was paradise. They had not stood on solid earth for 497 days. As the boats ground onto the rocky pebble beach, men fell to their knees. Some tried to drink from a glacial stream and fainted. Others simply lay on the stones, laughing and crying hysterically. They were safe from the ice. But as they looked around their new home, the reality set in. Elephant Island was a desolate rock. It was off all shipping lanes. No one would ever come here looking for them. They had escaped the ice, but they had only traded a floating prison for a stationary one. They would starve here or freeze, and the snow would cover their bones, and the world would never know what happened to the crew of the Endurance. Shackleton knew this. He looked at his exhausted, battered men. They could not survive another winter here. There was only one hope, a slim, suicidal hope. Someone had to go for help. The nearest inhabited outpost was a whaling station on South Georgia Island. To get there meant crossing the Drake Passage, the most turbulent stretch of ocean on the planet. It was a distance of 800 miles across the furious 50s, where waves commonly reached the height of a 6-story building and hurricane-force winds were the norm. And they would have to do it in the James Caird, a 22-foot lifeboat.
It was a mission that seasoned sailors would call suicide, but the alternative was death for everyone. Shackleton made his choice. He would take 5 men, Worsley for navigation, Crean, a giant of a man who seemed indestructible, the carpenter Chippy McNeish, and 2 strong sailors, McCarthy and Vincent. They spent days modifying the James Caird. McNeish, working with frozen fingers and improvised tools, raised the sides of the boat with scavenged wood and canvas to keep out the waves. He sealed the seams with seal blood and oil. They loaded it with rocks for ballast and packed supplies for 4 weeks. If they didn't make it in 4 weeks, they would be dead anyway. On Easter Monday, 1916, the James Caird was pushed into the surf. The 22 men remaining on Elephant Island stood on the beach, watching their leader and their only hope disappear into the gray mist. Frank Wild, left in charge of the island party, led a cheer, but it was swallowed by the roar of the surf. As the boat vanished, a terrible silence fell over the beach. Out in the ocean, the James Caird was immediately assaulted. The boat was tiny, a speck of wood in a universe of water. They were tossed like a cork.
The men slept in shifts, crawling into the wet, dark bowels of the boat, lying on top of the hard rocks of the ballast, water dripping on their faces. The sleeping bags, made of reindeer fur, began to rot and shed hair, which got into their mouths and noses. They were constantly wet. Saltwater sores covered their bodies. The cold was a physical agony, gnawing at their bones. Worsley navigated by glimpses of the sun or stars, snatched between storm clouds. It was a feat of navigation that remains legendary. If he was off by even a degree, they would miss South Georgia and be swept out into the endless Atlantic to die of thirst and starvation. They faced waves that Shackleton later described as the largest he had ever seen in 20 years at sea. "We felt our boat lifted and flung forward like a cork in breaking surf," he wrote. "We were in a seething chaos of tortured water." One night, Shackleton at the tiller saw a line of clearing sky in the south. He called out to the men that the weather was breaking. Then, a moment later, he realized with a jolt of horror that it was not the sky. It was the white foam crest of a rogue wave, so monstrous it stretched across the entire horizon, blotting out the stars. "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on!" he screamed. The wave struck them with the force of a falling mountain. The boat was buried. For an eternity they were underwater, darkness and roaring water everywhere. They gasped for air in the pockets of the boat. Miraculously, the James Caird shuddered and rose to the surface, half full of water. They bailed for their lives, flinging water out with pots, sleeping bags, anything they could grab, knowing that one more wave would send them to the bottom. They survived, but just barely. After 14 days of this hell, they saw a patch of kelp floating in the water, then birds, and then, through a rift in the fog, the black cliffs of South Georgia. They had done the impossible. They had crossed the Drake Passage in an open boat, but the sea was not done with them. A hurricane struck just as they approached the coast. For 9 hours they battled gale-force winds that threatened to smash them against the unseen cliffs. They could hear the roar of the breakers crashing against the rocks, a sound of utter destruction. They were so close to salvation, yet death was reaching out to grab them at the finish line. Finally, the wind shifted. They found a small inlet, King Haakon Bay, and crash-landed the boat. They crawled onto the shore, falling onto the tussock grass, drinking from a stream of fresh water. They were alive, but they were on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the north coast. Between them and help lay the interior of South Georgia, a maze of glaciers, jagged peaks, and snowfields that had never been crossed by man. The boat was too battered to sail around the island. They would have to walk. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean prepared for the final test. The other 3 men were too weak to walk. They left them under the upturned boat and set off. They had no climbing gear, no tents, no maps. They had a carpenter's adze to cut steps in the ice and a length of rope. They climbed into the mountains, driven by the knowledge that their friends on Elephant Island were starving. They trudged through soft snow, crossed razor-sharp ridges where a single slip meant a fall of thousands of feet. Fog rolled in, blinding them. At one point, night was falling and they were trapped on a high ridge. If they stayed, they would freeze. They had to get down. Shackleton peered into the fog below. It was a steep slope, disappearing into darkness. He couldn't see the bottom. "We have to slide," he said. It was madness, sliding down an unknown mountain in the dark, but they had no choice. They sat on their coiled ropes like sleds, locked their arms around each other, and pushed off. They plummeted into the void, wind screaming in their ears, speed building until they were hurtling through the darkness. They hit a bank of snow at the bottom, tumbling over each other, laughing with relief. They had descended thousands of feet in minutes without dying. They marched on. They heard a steam whistle in the distance, the 7 a.m. whistle at the Stromness whaling station. It was the first sound of civilization they had heard in nearly 2 years. It was the sweetest sound in the world. When they finally staggered into the whaling station, they looked like monsters from a myth. Their hair hung to their shoulders, matted and filthy. Their clothes were rags, black with blubber smoke and blood. Their faces were scarred from frostbite and wind. The whaling manager looked at them in horror. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. The man in the center, despite his rags, stood tall. "I am Shackleton," he rasped. "We have lost our ship."
The silence in the manager's house at Stromness was thick, broken only by the ticking of a clock, a sound Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean had not heard in nearly 2 years. They stood there, dripping on the polished floorboards, smelling of death and old blubber, while the station manager, Mr. Sorrell, stared at them as if they were ghosts resurrected from the seabed. When Shackleton finally spoke his name, the shock in the room was palpable. Sorrell, a hardened Norwegian whaler who had seen everything the Antarctic could throw at a man, wept. He didn't just offer them help, he offered them a reverence usually reserved for the dead who returned to life. Within hours, the machinery of civilization, which had felt so distant to the men, began to turn in their favor. The 3 explorers were bathed, shaved, and given fresh clothes. Worsley later recalled the sensation of warm water and soap as almost painful in its pleasure, washing away layers of grime that had become a second skin. They looked in the mirror and barely recognized the clean-shaven stranger staring back. But there was no time for rest. Shackleton's mind was already casting back across the terrifying expanse of the interior mountains to King Haakon Bay, where McCarthy, Vincent, and McNeish lay waiting under the overturned James Caird. They were too weak to walk. They needed immediate rescue. Worsley boarded a whaler that very night, navigating the ship around the coast to pick up their comrades. When he found them, they did not recognize the clean-shaven officer on the deck. They thought the whalers were strangers until Worsley spoke. The reunion was brief and emotional, but for Shackleton, the relief was fleeting. 6 men were safe. 22 remained on Elephant Island, stranded on a spit of rock surrounded by the most hostile ocean on Earth. While Shackleton began his frantic diplomatic efforts to secure a rescue ship, the situation on Elephant Island was descending into a grim struggle for existence. Frank Wild, the second in command left in charge, was a man of infinite patience and quiet strength. He knew that despair was a more lethal killer than the cold. The 22 men had constructed a shelter from the 2 remaining lifeboats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills. They turned them upside down and placed them on low stone walls, stretching canvas and old tent fabric between them to create a makeshift hut. They called it the Snuggery, a name dripping with ironic humor, for it was anything but snug. It was a dark, cramped, smoky cavern where the men lay packed like sardines, shoulder to shoulder. The floor was a mixture of guano and mud that thawed into a foul slime when the body heat rose. The weather on Elephant Island was atrocious. A ceaseless gale battered their shelter, tearing at the canvas and forcing snow through every crack. But the true enemy was hunger. The seal population, their primary food source, had migrated away for the winter. The men were reduced to digging up old seal bones from the beach to boil for soup, or hunting the pitifully few penguins that wandered ashore. They ate everything: the meat, the skin, the heart, the liver. They even boiled the seaweed. As the weeks dragged into months, the physical toll became horrific. Men's faces grew gaunt, their eyes hollow. They suffered from boils and saltwater sores that refused to heal. But the most terrifying medical crisis involved Perce Blackborough, the young stowaway who had hidden on the Endurance back in Buenos Aires, hoping for adventure. His feet had been severely frostbitten during the boat journey. Now gangrene had set in. The toes on his left foot were black and lifeless, the rot threatening to spread up his leg and kill him. The expedition's surgeons, Macklin and McElroy, knew they had to act. In the dim, flickering light of a blubber lamp, inside a hut made of overturned boats, they prepared for surgery. They had limited chloroform and instruments that had been boiled in a tin can. With the wind howling outside, they put Blackborough to sleep and amputated his toes. The operation was a success, a testament to the skill of the doctors working in hellish conditions, but it left Blackborough an invalid, unable to move, dependent entirely on his starving comrades. Through it all, Frank Wilde kept the flame of hope alive. Every morning he would crawl out of his sleeping bag, push aside the canvas flap, and scan the horizon. He would then turn back to the men, shivering in their bags, and say with absolute conviction, "Roll up your bags, boys, the boss may be coming today." It became a ritual, a daily prayer. Some men believed him. Others, like the carpenter McNeish, had grown cynical and bitter, convinced that Shackleton had perished in the boat journey and that they were doomed to die on this rock. But no one dared voice these thoughts too loudly in front of Wilde. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Shackleton was fighting a different kind of battle. He had reached the Falkland Islands and was desperately trying to find a ship capable of penetrating the pack ice to reach Elephant Island. The world, however, was at war. World War I was raging in Europe, consuming ships, men, and resources. The plight of 22 explorers stuck on a rock seemed insignificant to the admirals and politicians focused on the trenches of the Western Front. Shackleton was met with bureaucracy and delays. He was a man possessed, his hair turning white from the stress, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He sent cables, begged governments, and leveraged every contact he had.
His first attempt at rescue was aboard a precipitous vessel named the Southern Sky. It was a whaler, tough but not built for heavy ice. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean boarded her with high hopes, steaming south in late May. They got within 70 miles of Elephant Island before they hit the pack. The ice was impenetrable, a solid white wall stretching to the horizon. The Southern Sky lacked the coal capacity to wait for a lead to open. Defeated, they had to turn back. Shackleton was crushed. He knew that with every passing day, the food supplies on the island were dwindling. He did not stop. He traveled to Uruguay and secured a trawler, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1. Again, they steamed south. Again, the ice mocked them. They came within sight of the peaks of Elephant Island, tantalizingly close, but the pack was too thick. The trawler was not reinforced for ice. If they pushed too hard, the hull would be crushed, and they would all die. For the second time, Shackleton had to give the order to turn the wheel. The frustration was physically painful. He wrote to his wife, Emily, "The ice is the devil." The third attempt was aboard a schooner named the Emma. It was a leaky, rotting wooden ship that Shackleton chartered in desperation. They towed it south with a steam tug, hoping to use the tug's power to get close and then sail the Emma through the ice. But the Southern Ocean unleashed its fury. A gale struck, tossing the Emma like a toy. The engine failed. The men were seasick, freezing, and exhausted. They were forced to retreat to Port Stanley in the Falklands, the ship barely afloat. It was now August. The men on Elephant Island had been stranded for 4 months. The Antarctic winter was at its peak. Shackleton was running out of options, and he knew his men were running out of time. Back on the island, the situation was critical. The food was almost gone. They were digging up putrid seal flippers buried in the guano for emergencies. The psychological strain was breaking them. One man, arguably the most stoic of them all, began to weep uncontrollably over spilled milk powder. Another suffered from a heart condition that left him gasping for breath. They spent their days speculating on how they would die, starvation or cold. They wrote letters to their loved ones, sealing them in tins, hoping that someday, years later, a whaler might find their skeletons and the notes. But on August 25, 1916, in Punta Arenas, Chile, Shackleton secured one last chance. The Chilean government offered him the Yelcho, a small steel-hulled steam tug. It was entirely unsuited for Antarctic exploration. It had no ice-strengthened hull, no radio, and no proper heating. It was a harbor tug designed to pull ships in calm waters, not to battle the Weddell Sea. But the captain, Luis Pardo, was a man of immense bravery. He volunteered to take the ship south, knowing the risks. Shackleton accepted. It was a suicide mission in a tin can, but it was the only card left to play. The Yelcho steamed south, battling high seas that rolled the little tug nearly onto her beam ends. Shackleton stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon,
hardly eating or sleeping. As they approached the latitude of Elephant Island, a miracle occurred. The ice, which had blocked them 3 times before, had opened. The strong gales had blown the pack to the north, leaving a channel of open water leading directly to the island. They steamed through the fog, navigating by Worsley's uncanny instinct. On morning of August 30th, 1916, on Elephant Island, the men were preparing a lunch of boiled seal backbone. Marston, the expedition's artist, was outside, peering through the mist. He saw a shape. He blinked, thinking it was another hallucination or an oddly shaped iceberg. But the shape moved. It had a smokestack. "Ship-o!" Marston screamed. "Ship-o!" Inside the hut, the men froze. Then pandemonium erupted. Weak, starving men who hadn't moved quickly in months scrambled over each other, tearing through the canvas walls, stumbling out onto the rocky beach. They waved their arms. They shouted with voices that were hoarse and cracked. They ignited a drum of kerosene, sending a column of black smoke into the sky to mark their position. From the bridge of the Yelcho, Shackleton peered through his binoculars. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the tiny, dark figures jumping on the beach. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. He moved his lips as he counted. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Worsley, tears streaming down his weather-beaten face. "They are all there, Skipper," he said, his voice trembling. "They are all there." The rescue was frantic. The Yelcho could not anchor in the deep, rocky waters, so she maneuvered close to the surf. Shackleton himself took the small boat in. As he neared the beach, he threw packages of cigarettes to the men, a gesture of pure camaraderie that they would remember for the rest of their lives. He didn't ask about the expedition, or the scientific data, or the equipment. He simply yelled, "Are you all well?" Within an hour, all 22 men were aboard the Yelcho. They left everything behind: the boat hut, the reeking seal bones, the memories of their icy prison. As the tug turned north, speeding away from the closing ice pack, which threatened to trap them one last time, the men of the Endurance looked back at Elephant Island. It shrank into the mist, a gray tomb that had failed to claim them. The return to civilization was a blur of overwhelming sensations. When they arrived in Punta Arenas, Chile, the entire city turned out to greet them. Crowds lined the docks, cheering the mad Englishman who had refused to let his men die. But the most poignant moment came later. The world they returned to was not the one they had left. The 20th century had marched on in their absence. The Great War had changed the face of the globe. Millions were dead. The heroic age of exploration was over, replaced by the mechanical age of destruction. Yet the story of the Endurance stood apart. In a time when men were being slaughtered in millions in trenches, led by generals who viewed them as cannon fodder, Shackleton had achieved something diametrically opposite. He had led men into the most hostile environment on Earth, lost his ship, faced impossible odds, and brought every single one of them home alive. Not a life was lost. It was a triumph of leadership, of loyalty, and of the sheer refusal to accept defeat. Years later, one of the men would write that when things were at their worst, when the world was dark and the end seemed certain, if he had to choose a leader to pray to, it would not be a brilliant strategist or a scientific genius. For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. The Endurance expedition did not map a new continent. It did not discover new scientific laws. By the traditional metrics of exploration, it was a failure. But it remains one of the greatest success stories in human history because it redefined what success means. It showed that the greatest glory is not in conquering the land, but in conquering the despair within oneself, and in the enduring bond of brotherhood that can survive even when the world itself shatters. As the survivors dispersed, returning to a world at war, many of them ironically went on to fight and die in the trenches of Europe within months of their return. but on the ice they had touched something immortal. They had looked death in the eye for 2 years and forced it to blink. And at the center of it all was the boss, Sir Ernest Shackleton, the man who believed that life was the only prize worth fighting for. This concludes the immediate saga of the Endurance. However, history is rarely so neat, and the echoes of this event rippled through time in fascinating ways. There are untold stories of what happened to the men afterwards, the fate of the ship itself, which was rediscovered at the bottom of the ocean more than a century later in a condition that stunned the world, and other survival stories from the heroic age that rival this one.
While the rescue of the 22 men from Elephant Island was hailed as a miracle, and Shackleton was toasted in the halls of Santiago and London as the greatest leader on Earth, there was a darker, colder chapter to the Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition that remained largely unspoken in the celebratory headlines. To fully understand the magnitude of this saga, one must look to the other side of the Antarctic continent, where a second ship and a second crew were fighting a battle that was, in many ways, even more desperate than Shackleton's. This is the story of the Ross Sea Party, the forgotten men of the expedition. Shackleton's original plan, the audacious crossing of the continent, relied on a crucial support system. He knew that even if he made it across the South Pole, his team would be starving and exhausted by the time they reached the Beardmore Glacier on the other side. Therefore, he had sent a second ship, the Aurora, to the opposite side of Antarctica. Its mission was not to cross the continent, but to lay supply depots, caches of food and fuel, at strategic intervals for Shackleton to find during the last leg of his journey. If the Ross Sea Party failed to lay these depots, Shackleton and his men would reach the glacier only to die of starvation. The tragic irony, of course, was that Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, had been crushed before he even started the crossing. He never set foot on the continent. But the men of the Aurora didn't know that. They had no radio contact. They believed Shackleton was on his way. They believed that if they didn't march into the blizzards to place the food, their leader would die. The Aurora arrived at McMurdo Sound in January 1915. The team, led by Aeneas McIntosh, a man of fierce loyalty but questionable judgment, immediately began the hard work of hauling supplies onto the ice. But disaster struck early. In May 1915, a massive blizzard hit the Sound. The Aurora, which was anchored to the sea ice, was ripped from its moorings by the sheer force of the gale. The ship was blown out to sea, trapped in the ice pack, and drifted helplessly away, just like the Endurance. 10 men were left stranded on the ice at Cape Evans. But unlike Shackleton's men, who had time to salvage supplies from their sinking ship, the shore party of the Aurora was left with almost nothing. The ship had disappeared with their winter clothing, their fuel, the majority of their food, and their soap. They were 10 men abandoned at the edge of the world in the clothes they stood in. They took shelter in an old hut left behind by Captain Scott's expedition years earlier. They scavenged for leftovers, old biscuits, seal blubber for fuel, and canvas to make trousers. Despite this catastrophe, McIntosh made a decision that borders on the superhuman. He decided that the mission must continue. He assumed Shackleton was crossing the continent. He assumed Shackleton was counting on them. "We have to lay the depots," McIntosh told his ragged, freezing men, "or the boss will die." In October 1915, around the same time Shackleton's Endurance was being crushed, the Ross Sea Party began their death march. They had to haul tons of supplies across the Great Ice Barrier to the Beardmore Glacier, a distance of hundreds of miles. They lacked proper sledging dogs, they had only a few, and their equipment was improvised from scrap. They harnessed themselves to the sledges, becoming human draft animals. The journey was a nightmare. The physical toll was horrific. Arnold Spencer Smith, the expedition's chaplain and photographer, was the first to falter. He developed scurvy, his gums blackening, his legs swelling until they were useless, but he refused to quit. The men laid him on the sledge and pulled him, continuing south.
They reached the target latitude, laid the final depot, and turned back. They had done their duty. They had placed the food that would save Shackleton. They didn't know they were saving a ghost. The return journey became a race against death. Spencer Smith was dying. McIntosh, the leader, was also crippled by scurvy, unable to stand. Another man, Victor Hayward, was failing fast. The healthy man, Ernest Joyce, Dick Richards, and Ernest Wild, Frank Wild's brother, were starving skeletons, dragging their fallen comrades on the sledges. On March 9, 1916, at 4 a.m., in the midst of a blizzard, the chaplain Spencer Smith passed away. He died in his sleeping bag, apologizing to the others for being a burden. They buried him in the ice, marking his grave with a bamboo cross. The survivors pressed on. They eventually reached the safety of Hut Point, a small shelter near the coast. They were alive, but barely. They ate seal meat to cure their scurvy and slowly regained their strength. But the tragedy was not over. In May 1916, McIntosh and Hayward, restless and anxious to return to the main base at Cape Evans, where the other survivors were waiting, decided to walk across the sea ice. The others begged them not to go. The ice was thin, the weather unstable. "We'll be fine," McIntosh insisted. They walked out into a blizzard and were never seen again. The ice likely broke beneath them, swallowing them into the dark waters of the Ross Sea. Their bodies were never found. Of the 10 men left ashore, 3 were dead. They had sacrificed their lives to lay food for a man who was thousands of miles away, eating seal steaks on Elephant Island. When Shackleton finally arrived in New Zealand in 1917 to rescue the survivors of the Ross Sea Party and heard the story of their sacrifice, he wept openly. He wrote later that the depots they laid were a monument to their duty. When Shackleton and his men finally returned to England in 1917, they didn't return to parades. They returned to a slaughterhouse. World War I was in its bloodiest phase. The contrast was jarring. They had spent 2 years fighting nature to keep each other alive. Now they were thrust into a conflict where men were killed by the thousands in minutes. The Shackleton spirit, that refusal to leave a man behind, was antithetical to the logic of trench warfare. Yet the men of the Endurance volunteered almost immediately. They felt a duty to their country. Tim McCarthy, the young Irish sailor who had survived the open boat journey of the James Caird, was killed in action just weeks after returning. His ship torpedoed in the English Channel. He survived the Drake Passage in a 20-foot boat, only to die in a burning oil slick. Alfred Cheatham, the unassuming boatswain, was also killed at sea when his ship was torpedoed a few weeks before the war ended. Frank Wild, Shackleton's right hand, served in Russia and witnessed the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. Tom Crean, the unbreakable Irishman, served in the Royal Navy, survived the war, and quietly retired to his village in Kerry to open a pub called the South Pole Inn. He never spoke of his adventures again.
Shackleton himself was tormented. He was too old for the front lines, so he served in a diplomatic role and later in the grandly named Siren Force in northern Russia, organizing winter equipment for troops. But he was a fish out of water. Civilized life did not suit him. He drank too much. He made bad business investments. He felt the call of the little voices, the lure of the frozen South. The ice was dangerous, yes, but it was honest. The civilized world, with its politics and industrial slaughter, was deceptive. In 1921, unable to find peace on land, Shackleton organized one last expedition. It was the Shackleton Rowett Expedition aboard the ship Quest. It was a vague mission, some mapping, some oceanography, but the goal didn't matter. He just needed to go. Many of his old crew, including Worsley and Wild, joined him. They couldn't say no to the boss. On January 4, 1922, the Quest arrived at South Georgia, the site of their greatest triumph. That night, Shackleton wrote in his diary, "A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay." Early the next morning,
he suffered a massive heart attack in his cabin. The expedition physician, Dr. Macklin, who had amputated Blackburrow's toes on Elephant Island, rushed to his side. Shackleton, gasping for pain, asked what he should do. "You should lead a quieter life, boss," Macklin said. Shackleton laughed softly. "You are always wanting me to give up things. What is it I should give up now?" Moments later, he died. He was 47 years old. His wife, Emily, when contacted, asked that he be buried there, on South Georgia. "He belongs to the ice," she said. And so the boss was laid to rest in the whalers' cemetery at Grytviken, facing south, towards Antarctica. The Century of Silence. With Shackleton's death, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration came to a symbolic end. The wooden ships were replaced by steel icebreakers. The dogs were replaced by tractors and airplanes. The Endurance, however, remained. It lay 3,000 meters, roughly 10,000 feet, down at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. For over a century, the wreck of the Endurance was considered the unreachable ghost. The Weddell Sea is widely regarded by oceanographers as the most treacherous stretch of water on the planet. A circular current, the Weddell Gyre, keeps the region packed with thick, multi-year ice that can crush even modern nuclear icebreakers. The location where Worsley had calculated the ship went down was deep within this evil sea. Many dreamed of finding her. To marine archaeologists, the Endurance was the Titanic of the South. But unlike the Titanic, which was destroyed by the iceberg and the impact with the bottom, there was a hope, a theory, that the Endurance might be intact. The water at that depth is absolute zero temperature, devoid of wood-eating worms, Teredo nivalis, that consume shipwrecks in warmer waters. The lack of light and oxygen meant that preservation could be perfect. But getting there was the problem. Several attempts were made. All failed. The ice was simply too thick. The Endurance protected herself with a shield of frozen armor. Then came 2022. In the centennial year of Shackleton's death, the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust launched the most advanced underwater search mission in history, Endurance 22. This was not a wooden boat adventure. This was high-tech warfare against the elements. They chartered the S.A. Agulhas II, a massive South African ice-breaking polar supply and research ship. She was a red-hulled beast of a vessel, equipped with state-of-the-art thrusters and cranes. But the real stars of the mission were the Sabertooths, hybrid underwater vehicles made by Saab. These were $4 million robots capable of descending to the crushing depths of the ocean floor, equipped with high-definition cameras and laser scanners. The expedition leader was Dr. John Shears, a veteran polar geographer, and the director of exploration was Menson Bound, a legendary maritime archaeologist who had spent his life dreaming of this wreck. They knew the odds were against them. The plan was to batter their way into the Weddell Sea, find a patch of ice stable enough to launch the robots, and then search a box of the ocean floor based on Worsley's coordinates from 1915. The mission began in February 2022. Tension was high. The ice conditions were surprisingly favorable at first, allowing the S.A. Agulhas II to penetrate deep into the pack. But as they neared the search site, the temperature dropped. The sea began to freeze around them. The captain of the Agulhas II had to constantly maneuver the ship to prevent it from becoming trapped, just as the Endurance had been. For 2 weeks, the Sabertooth scoured the muddy bottom of the Weddell Sea. It was a tedious process. The team sat in the control room, staring at screens showing endless gray mud. They were looking for a wooden anomaly in a flat desert. The days ticked by. The weather worsened. The Antarctic winter was approaching. The team began to fear they would fail. The captain warned them they only had a few days left before the ice would become too dangerous to stay. On March 5, 1922, exactly 100 years to the day Shackleton was buried, the sonar on the Sabertooth picked up a contact. It was not a rock.
It was geometric. The team gathered in the control room, holding their breath. The pilot flew the robot closer. Out of the eternal darkness, illuminated by the robot's floodlights for the first time in 107 years, a shape emerged. It was wood, timbers. The robot moved up, and then there it was, the stern of the ship, and on the stern, beneath a star, the brass letters were still gleaming, untouched by time, readable as if they had been polished yesterday. Endurance. The room erupted. Men and women who had spent their careers in stoic academic study hugged and cried. But the shock came as they surveyed the rest of the ship. It was not a pile of debris. It was immaculate. The ship was sitting upright on the keel, proud on the seabed. The paint was still visible. The helm, the very wheel Shackleton and Worsley had stood behind, was intact. You could still see the gear piled on the deck. A boot was spotted. Crockery. The flare gun used to signal to the men on the ice was still there. The cold, dark water had acted as a perfect time capsule. It was spooky. It looked as if the ship had just sunk 5 minutes ago. The damage from the ice that crushed her was visible. The bowed deck, the snapped masts, but the dignity of the vessel remained. She hadn't been destroyed. She had just moved to a deeper ocean. The footage beamed back to the world on March 9, 2022, stunned the global public. In a world of 4K clarity, people could see the wood grain of a ship that was lost before their grandparents were born. It was a viral sensation, a moment of pure wonder in a difficult year. But for those who knew the story, it was more than just archaeology. It was a final connection. The ship was found only 4 miles from the position Captain Worsley had calculated with his sextant and pen while the ship was being crushed. It was a posthumous vindication of his genius as a navigator. The wreck was designated a protected historic site and monument. Nothing was touched. Nothing was brought to the surface. The Endurance remains there, the queen of the deep, guarding the memories of the 28 men who called her home. The story of the Endurance is often called a successful failure. They failed to cross the continent. They lost their ship. They lost money. But they won something far more valuable. In the United States and around the world, the story resonates because it is the ultimate case study in resilience. It strips the human experience down to its rawest components: cold, hunger, fear, and love. Yes, love. Not romantic love, but the deep, abiding love of comrades who refuse to let one another die. Shackleton's leadership style is now taught in business schools across America. His ability to manage morale, to pivot when plans failed, and to keep toxic negativity at bay is seen as the gold standard of crisis management. But the real lesson is simpler. When the world breaks apart, when the ship sinks and the ice closes in, whether that is a lost job, a health crisis, or a global pandemic, the response is what matters. Shackleton didn't mourn the ship. He didn't waste energy on what if. He looked at the ice and said, "So now we'll go home." It is a story that reminds us that human beings are tougher than we think, that hope is a physical force, and that endurance is not just about surviving. It's about moving forward, one step at a time, until you find your own Elephant Island, and eventually your own South Georgia.
The ice of Antarctica was a clean white hell, a place where nature killed you with indifference. But thousands of miles away and 70 years earlier, in the high Sierra Nevada mountains of California, a different kind of white hell was forged. One not just of freezing cold, but of human error, bad luck, and a hunger so profound it would shatter the boundaries of civilized society. This is the story of the Donner Party, a name that has become synonymous with the darkest desperation in American history. It began with a dream,
as all American tragedies do. The year was 1846. Manifest destiny was the fever gripping the nation. From the crowded cities of the East and the muddy farms of the Midwest, eyes turned west. California was the promised land, a place of eternal sunshine, fertile soil, and free land for anyone brave enough to walk there. In Springfield, Illinois, two brothers, George and Jacob Donner, along with their friend James Reed, were caught up in the fever. They were not desperate refugees. They were wealthy, well-respected men. They loaded their wagons not with mere scraps, but with fine furniture, crates of books, expensive fabrics, and large sums of cash. They believed they were embarking on a grand adventure, a well-planned relocation of their families to a paradise on the Pacific coast. They had no idea that they were packing their own hearses. The caravan that rolled out of Independence, Missouri in May 1846 was a picture of optimism. The wagons were painted in bright colors. Children played in the tall prairie grass as the oxen plodded along. They were part of a massive migration that year, hundreds of wagons stretching like a disjointed snake across the Great Plains. But time was the invisible enemy. The journey to California had a strict deadline. You had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before the first heavy snows fell, usually in late October or early November. If you were late, the mountains became a wall of ice. The Donners and Reeds were already running slightly behind schedule when they reached Fort Bridger in Wyoming. It was here, in July, that they made the decision that would seal their fate. They met a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings was an ambitious promoter who had published a guide titled The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In it, he touted a new route, the Hastings Cutoff, which he claimed would shave 300 miles off the journey. There was just one problem. Hastings had never actually traveled the full route with wagons when he wrote the book. James Reed, a man of intelligence but also of stubborn pride, was captivated by the idea of a shortcut. The veteran mountain men at the fort warned him. "Stick to the old trail," they said. "It's long, but it's known. This cutoff is a trap." But Reed convinced the Donner brothers and several other families to take the gamble. On July 20th, the group that would become known as the Donner Party, 87 men, women, and children, turned their wagons away from the main trail and headed into the unknown. The shortcut was a nightmare from the start. Instead of a smooth road, they found rugged canyons choked with boulders and brush. They had to hack a road through the wilderness with axes and shovels, moving barely a mile a day. The oxen grew exhausted. Tempers flared. What was supposed to save them time was costing them weeks. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had stated it was a dry drive of perhaps 40 miles. In reality, it was an 80-mile stretch of salt and alkali mud that baked under a merciless sun. The wagons sank to their axles in the sludge. The oxen, crazed for thirst, broke their yokes and ran off into the desert night. Miraculously, no one died, but the crossing took 6 days instead of 2. By the time they staggered out of the desert, they were exhausted, their livestock was depleted, and the group was fracturing socially. Violence erupted. In early October, during a heated argument on the trail, James Reed, the de facto leader of the group, stabbed a teamster named John Snyder in self-defense. Snyder died. The group, angry and frightened, banished Reed. He was forced to leave his wife and children behind and ride ahead alone, an outcast in the wilderness. It seemed like the worst punishment imaginable, but ironically, it was the thing that would save his life and give the others a sliver of hope. As October waned, the Donner Party finally approached the foot of the Sierra Nevada. They were weeks behind schedule. The clouds gathering around the peaks were dark and heavy, the color of bruised iron. The Paiute Indians in the area looked at the sky and vanished, knowing what was coming. The emigrants pushed their exhausted oxen forward, desperate to crest the pass. On October 31st, the forward section of the party reached the foot of the pass. It started to snow, just a light dusting at first, soft and pretty. They camped thinking they would cross in the morning. That night, the sky opened. It was not a storm, it was an atmospheric burial. Snow fell not in inches, but in feet. When they woke the next morning, the pass was blocked by 5 feet of fresh powder. They tried to push the wagons through, but the oxen floundered and sunk, burying themselves in the drifts. The families panicked. They abandoned the wagons and tried to walk, carrying their children, but the snow was too deep. They were trapped. They retreated to Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, just east of the pass. They were imprisoned. The trap had snapped shut. There were 2 main camps. The Breen, Graves, and Murphy families, along with the Reed family, without James, huddled in rough cabins near the lake. Several miles away, at Alder Creek, the Donner brothers and their families were forced to camp in hasty tents, pinned down by the storm before they could reach the lake. November brought a relentless assault of winter. The snow piled up to the roofs of the cabins. The emigrants were plunged into a world of white darkness. They had slaughtered most of their cattle, but the meat was lean and disappeared quickly. They began to eat the oxen hides. They boiled the leather to make a glue-like paste that stuck to their ribs but provided no nourishment. They caught the mice that scurried into the cabins. They boiled the bones of old carcasses over and over until they crumbled. Inside the cabins, the atmosphere was suffocating. The Breen cabin, for instance, housed 9 family members and several others in a damp, dark space. The smoke from the fire had nowhere to go. The smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and fear was overpowering. Outside, the snow depth reached 20 feet. They were living in snow caves, buried alive.
By mid-December, death began to visit. The first to die were the single men, those with less body fat and no family to care for them. Bayless Williams died on December 14th, then Jacob Donner, then others. The survivors were too weak to dig graves in the frozen ground, so they dragged the bodies outside and covered them with snow. Desperation breeds madness. On December 16th, a group of 15 of the strongest survivors, 10 men and 5 women, decided to try and walk out. They made crude snowshoes from ox bows and rawhide. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. It was a suicide mission, but staying meant certain death. They set out for the pass, climbing straight up into the teeth of the blizzard. They carried only meager rations of starvation beef, bits of dried meat, barely enough for 6 days. It took them days just to crest the summit. Then they were lost in the maze of peaks. On the 6th day, the food ran out. For the next 2 days, they chewed on a strip of frosted buffalo robe. Then, nothing. The wind howled, stripping the heat from their bodies. Stanton, one of the leaders who would become snowblind, sat down against a tree, lighting his pipe. "I am coming soon," he told the others. They left him there to freeze. Christmas came and went. The Forlorn Hope was starving. They were delirious. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor, went mad, ripping off his clothes and running into the blizzard before collapsing. He died in the night. Then the taboo was broken. The survivors looked at the bodies of their fallen comrades. There was meat there, life. It was the ultimate violation of civilized law, a descent into the primal. But the hunger was a physical agony, a creature clawing at their insides. Someone took a knife. They roasted the flesh of the dead men. They averted their eyes. They wept, but they ate. Thus fueled, the survivors of the Forlorn Hope staggered on. But death kept coming. The group was whittled down. Old wounds reopened. Finally, after 33 days of wandering, 7 pitiful skeletons stumbled into an Indian rancheria on the western side of the mountains. The Native Americans were horrified by the sight of them. They fed them acorn bread and helped them reach safety. Of the 15 who had set out, only 7 survived. All 5 women had lived, only 2 men made it. News of the disaster reached the settlements in California. James Reed, who had been trying frantically to organize a rescue from the other side, was galvanized. But the war with Mexico was ongoing in California, stripping the area of able-bodied men and supplies. It took weeks to gather a rescue party. Back at the lake, the situation had descended into a horror story. The snow continued to fall. The cabins were buried so deep that the occupants had to cut ramps through the snow to get to the surface. Down in the dark, the families were slowly starving. The hides were gone. They boiled the rugs. They ate the family dogs. Margaret Reed, alone with her 4 children, was a pillar of strength. She managed to keep her children alive on a stew of oxhide and sheer will. But others were not so lucky. In the Murphy cabin, Milt Elliott died. In the Donner tents at Alder Creek, George Donner was dying of an infection in his hand. His wife, Tamsin, a small, fierce woman who had been a teacher, refused to leave his side, even though she could have escaped. She sent her children away with rescuers, but stayed to die with her husband. The first relief party, led by rescuers on snowshoes, didn't arrive until February 18, 1847. They crested the pass and looked down at the white expanse of the lake. All was silent. The snow was unbroken. They shouted, "Hello!" A woman emerged from a hole in the snow, like a creature from the underworld. She stared at them with hollow eyes and asked in a whisper, "Are you men from California, or are you from heaven?" The rescuers could only take a few people, mostly children. They distributed a small amount of food and turned back, leading a line of 23 refugees. But for those left behind, the nightmare wasn't over. There were still dozens trapped. As the weeks passed between relief parties, the final taboo shattered at the camps as well. In the Alder Creek camp, the survivors began to consume the bodies of those who died. Children were fed the flesh of their parents or cousins, sometimes without knowing, sometimes knowing all too well. It was a scene of Dantean horror. One man, Louis Kesseberg, a German immigrant who had been a source of conflict throughout the journey, took up residence in one of the cabins, surrounded by the dead. When the later rescue parties arrived, they found him alone, surrounded by half-eaten bodies. He was deranged, wild-eyed, and suspected of having killed Mrs. Murphy for food, though it was never proven. He was the last man brought out of the mountains in April 1447. The toll was devastating. Of the 87 people who entered the mountains, only 48 survived. The Donner Party became a grim legend, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of man against nature and the terrible fragility of social norms when the belly is empty. But amidst the horror, there were stories of incredible heroism. Tamsin Donner's refusal to leave her dying husband, James Reed's relentless efforts to save the family that had banished him, the strength of the children who walked through snowdrifts taller than themselves to reach freedom. One of the survivors, Virginia Reed, famously wrote a letter to her coven back home after reaching California. Her words serve as the haunting epitaph for the entire ordeal. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can.
From the freezing, claustrophobic white silence of the Sierra Nevada mountains, we shift our gaze nearly a century forward to a different kind of hell. This one was not white, but a deep, terrifying blue. It was not defined by the cold, but by a scorching, relentless heat. And the predators here were not the hunger within, but monsters from the deep. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis, the greatest loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy, and a nightmare that defies imagination. The date was July 26, 1945. The war in the Pacific was reaching its bloody crescendo. The Indianapolis, a majestic Portland-class heavy cruiser, had just completed a mission of the utmost secrecy. She had raced across the Pacific at record speed, delivering a crate to the island of Tinian. The contents of that crate were known only to a handful of men on Earth. It was the uranium core and the firing mechanism for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would soon be dropped on Hiroshima. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, a steely and respected officer, had done his job. The cargo was delivered. The world was about to change. Now, the Indy was ordered to sail to Leyte in the Philippines to join the invasion fleet for Japan. The crew of 1,195 men was in high spirits. They believed the war was nearly over. They were sailing through the backwater of the war zone, a stretch of ocean considered relatively safe. Because of this false sense of security, the Navy did not grant McVeigh an escort destroyer. The Indianapolis was sailing alone. On the night of July 29th, the ship was cutting through the Philippine Sea. It was a dark night, with heavy clouds obscuring the moon. Visibility was poor. At 11 p.m., Captain McVeigh ordered the ship to stop zigzagging, a defensive maneuver used to throw off enemy aim. Because the visibility was so low, he believed they were hidden by the darkness. He went to his cabin to sleep. But they were not hidden. Lurking beneath the black waves was the I-58, a Japanese submarine commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto. At 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, a hole opened in the clouds and a beam of moonlight illuminated the silhouette of the American cruiser. Hashimoto couldn't believe his luck. He fired 6 torpedoes. The first torpedo struck the Indianapolis on the starboard bow, blowing 40 feet of the ship's nose completely off. The second struck amidships, right under the fuel bunkers and powder magazines. The explosion was apocalyptic. The ship was essentially snapped in half. The fuel oil ignited, sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The communications room was incinerated instantly, meaning no distress signal could be sent out, or so they thought. The Indianapolis did not die a slow death like the Endurance. She died violently and quickly. She rolled onto her side and plunged beneath the waves in just 12 minutes. 12 minutes to turn a floating city into a tomb. Of the 1,195 men on board, about 300 went down with the ship. But the horror was just beginning for the survivors. Approximately 900 men made it into the water. They were covered in thick black fuel oil that clogged their eyes, noses, and throats. It made them vomit uncontrollably. They had few life rafts. Most were floating in cork life jackets, bobbing in the open ocean, hundreds of miles from nowhere. As the sun rose on the first day, July 30th, the men organized themselves into groups. There was a sense of discipline. They were the U.S. Navy. They assumed help was on the way. They knew the ship was overdue at Leyte. Surely someone would notice. Surely planes would be scrambling. But due to a catastrophic series of bureaucratic errors and incompetence at naval headquarters, no one noticed. The Indianapolis was not logged as arrived, yet no one raised the alarm. The 900 men were erased from the map. Then the visitors arrived. The sound of the explosion and the scent of blood in the water had sent a vibration through the ocean that traveled for miles. It drew the attention of the oceanic white-tip shark, a species that the oceanographer Jacques Cousteau later described as the most dangerous of all sharks. They are aggressive, opportunistic scavengers of the open seas.
At first, the sharks focused on the dead, the bodies floating in the water. The survivors, huddled in groups, could feel the bumps and nudges against their legs as the predators fed. The water around them turned red. But soon, the supply of corpses ran out. The sharks turned their attention to the living. The attacks began on the first afternoon. A piercing scream would shatter the calm, followed by a violent thrashing in the water, and then a man would simply vanish beneath the surface, leaving only a cloud of blood. The sharks were methodical. They would circle the groups, testing the perimeter. If a man drifted away, or if he was isolated, they would strike. Panic set in. The men formed tight circles, locking arms, placing the wounded in the center.
They kicked their legs and screamed to scare the beasts away. But the sharks were relentless. They attacked from below. Men would look down into the clear blue abyss and see the dark shapes rising like torpedoes. By the third day, the sun became an enemy equal to the sharks. The men were floating in the tropical Pacific with no cover, their skin blistered and peeled, their lips cracked open, their tongues swelled until they choked them. Severe dehydration set in, and with dehydration came madness. This was the phase of the disaster that the survivors later found most difficult to speak about. Thirst is a primal drive. Surrounded by water, some men could no longer resist the urge to drink. They cupped their hands and drank the salt water. The salt spiked the sodium levels in their blood, causing their brains to misfire. The hallucinations were vivid and contagious. One man would scream, "I see the island! It's right there! There's a hotel with cold beer!" He would start swimming away from the group toward the empty horizon. The others would yell at him to come back, but he would swim until the sharks took him, or until he drowned. Other hallucinations were violent. Men became convinced that their shipmates were Japanese spies trying to kill them. Fights broke out in the water. Men held each other underwater, drowning their friends in a delirium of paranoia. One group of men became convinced the ship hadn't sunk but was just beneath the surface and that the mess hall was open. They dove down to get food and never came back up. Captain McVeigh, floating in a small group, watched the disintegration of his crew with a broken heart. He tried to maintain order, but he was powerless against the biology of dying. By the fourth day, nearly 600 men had died in the water. The survivors were drifting in and out of comas. They had accepted that they were dead. But on the morning of August 2nd, a miracle occurred by pure accident. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was flying a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol. He was bored. He went back to the tail of the plane to fix a trailing antenna wire. As he looked down at the ocean to check the wire, he saw a long oil slick. Assuming it was an enemy submarine, he rushed back to the cockpit and dove the plane to drop depth charges. As he got closer, just before he released the bombs, he saw them, hundreds of black dots bobbing in the oil. They were waving. "My God," Gwynn whispered, "those are men." He radioed his base, "Many men in water." The Navy was confused. They had no reports of a sunken ship, but they sent a PBY Catalina rescue plane, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, to investigate. When Marks arrived at the scene, he saw the horror unfolding. He saw the sharks attacking the men as he circled overhead. He made a decision that violated standing orders. He was not supposed to land in the open ocean. The waves were too high and he could crash the plane. But Marks looked down and saw men being eaten alive. "I'm going in," he told his crew. He brought the heavy seaplane down in a shower of spray, bouncing dangerously off the swells. He taxied the plane toward the swimmers. The crew began pulling men out of the water. The plane was soon full. Marks kept pulling them in. He strapped men to the wings, covering the delicate fabric with parachute silk to protect it. He loaded men until the plane was so heavy it would never fly again. He turned his aircraft into a life raft. That night, the darkness returned, but this time, the men on the wings of the plane felt a sense of peace. They were out of the water. The sharks bumped against the pontoons of the plane, frustrated. The rescue ships arrived later that night. The searchlights of the USS Cecil J. Doyle cut through the darkness. The nightmare was over. But the tragedy had a bitter epilogue. Of the 1,195 men, only 316 survived. It was a massacre, and the Navy, looking for a scapegoat to cover up their incompetence in failing to track the ship, did something unprecedented. They court-martialed Captain McVeigh. He was charged with hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. It was a sham trial. The Navy even brought in Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander, to testify against McVeigh. The first time in history an enemy officer testified against a U.S. captain during war. Hashimoto actually defended McVeigh, stating that zigzagging would not have mattered. He would have hit the ship anyway with his Kai-10 torpedoes. Despite this, McVeigh was found guilty. His career was ruined. He received hate mail for decades from the families of the dead men. In 1968, unable to bear the guilt any longer, Charles McVeigh walked into his garden and shot himself with his service pistol. He was the final casualty of the Indianapolis. But the story didn't end there. In 1996, a 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott in Pensacola, Florida, watched the movie Jaws. He heard the character Quint deliver the famous monologue about the Indianapolis. Intrigued, the boy started a school history project. He interviewed the survivors. He gathered documents. He realized that McVeigh had been framed. The boy's research went all the way to Congress. The survivors rallied behind him. In October 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVeigh, and President Bill Clinton signed it. It took a child to correct the history that the adults had corrupted.
If the story of the Indianapolis is a testament to the horror of being lost in the ocean, the story of Apollo 13 is the ultimate saga of being lost in the infinite void. It is the flip side of the survival coin, not a battle against biology and predators, but a battle against physics, geometry, and limited oxygen. It is widely considered NASA's successful failure, a term that echoes Shackleton's experience, proving that American ingenuity shines brightest when the lights go out. The date was April 11, 1970. The space age was in full swing. America had already landed on the moon twice, Apollo 11 and 12. The public was beginning to get bored. Space travel had started to look routine. The launch of Apollo 13, commanded by the veteran Jim Lovell, along with Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes, was barely covered by the major TV networks. They were headed for the Fra Mauro Highlands of the moon. The mission was perfect for the first 2 days. The spacecraft, an engineering marvel consisting of the command module, Odyssey, and the lunar module, Aquarius, was coasting toward the moon. On the evening of April 13th, the crew had just finished a TV broadcast to Earth. Nobody had watched it. Mission Control in Houston, led by the intense chain-smoking flight director Gene Kranz, was relaxed. 13, we've got one more item for you to do. The Capcom radioed. We'd like you to stir your cryo tanks. It was a routine maintenance request. The oxygen tanks needed to be mixed to get an accurate reading. Jack Swigert flipped the switch to turn on the fans inside the tank. Inside oxygen tank number 2, a damaged wire sparked. The tank was a bomb. The spark ignited the insulation. The pressure spiked instantly. 200,000 miles from Earth, the side of the service module blew out. Houston, we've had a problem here. It was Swigert who said it first. Then Lovell repeated it. Houston, we've had a problem. On the ground, the telemetry screens went crazy. The flight controllers thought it was an instrument error. It wasn't possible for that many things to fail at once. But looking out the window, Jim Lovell saw the reality. We are venting something out into the nothingness, he reported. It's a gas of some sort. It was their oxygen. And with the oxygen went their power, because the fuel cells needed oxygen to generate electricity. The command module, Odyssey, their home and their only way back through Earth's atmosphere, was dying. It had minutes of power left. The plan to land on the moon was dead instantly. The new mission was simply survive. They had to move into the lunar module, Aquarius. It was designed to support 2 men for 2 days on the moon's surface. Now it had to support 3 men for 4 days in deep space. It was like trying to live in a closet while crossing the ocean.
The problems began to pile up like a collapsing tower. Problem 1, the trajectory. They were not on a path to return to Earth. They were on a path to swing around the moon. To get home, they needed to burn the engine, but the main engine on the service module was likely damaged by the explosion. If they tried to light it, the whole ship might blow up. They had to use the descent engine of the lunar module, an engine designed to gently lower them onto the moon, not to push a massive stack of metal across space. They made the burn. It was terrifyingly precise. They fired the engine while flying behind the moon, cut off from radio contact with Earth. If they messed up the angle, they would either bounce off the atmosphere into deep space forever or burn up on re-entry. Problem 2, the cold. To save power, they had to turn off almost everything in the ship. The temperature dropped to near freezing. Condensation began to form on the walls and panels. Fred Hayes developed a kidney infection, shaking uncontrollably with fever in the dark, damp, freezing tin can. They couldn't sleep. The cold soaked into their bones. Problem 3, the air. This was the killer. The lunar module had lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air, but they were round. The canisters in the dead command module, which they had plenty of, were square. The systems were not compatible. As the three men breathed, the CO2 levels rose. The warning light came on. They were slowly poisoning themselves. In Houston, a team of engineers was locked in a room. They dumped a pile of junk on a table: plastic bags, cardboard covers from flight manuals, duct tape, hoses, and socks. "This is what they have on the ship," the engineers said. "Build a filter that fits into the square hole using only this." It was the ultimate MacGyver moment. The engineers built a contraption that looked like a mailbox taped together with garbage. They radioed the instructions up to the crew. Lovell and Swigert tore covers off their flight plans and used duct tape, the greatest tool in the universe, to rig the device. They plugged it in. The fan whirred. The CO2 levels dropped. They could breathe. Problem 4, the re-entry. As they approached Earth, 4 days after the explosion, they had to power up the command module, Odyssey. It had been frozen and dead for days. No one knew if the moist electronics would short-circuit when turned on. If the computer failed, they were dead. Swigert, freezing and exhausted, followed the sequence written by the ground team. The systems hummed to life. Then came the separation. They jettisoned the service module, the part of the ship that had exploded. For the first time, they saw the damage. "There's one whole side of that spacecraft missing," Lovell exclaimed. The explosion had blown a massive panel off the ship, exposing the guts of the engine. It was a miracle the ship hadn't disintegrated. They climbed into the command module and cast off the lunar module Aquarius, the lifeboat that had saved them. "Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you," the Capcom said. The final hurdle was the heat shield. Had the explosion cracked it? If there was even a hairline fracture, the 5,000-degree plasma of re-entry would melt the astronauts instantly. They hit the atmosphere. The radio blackout began. Usually, it lasted 3 minutes. The world watched the clock. 3 minutes passed. Static. 4 minutes passed. The flight controllers in Houston were crying. The anchorman, Walter Cronkite, was holding back tears on national TV. They assumed the heat shield had failed. Then, at 4 minutes and 2 seconds, "Hello, Houston. This is Odyssey. It's good to see you again." 3 parachutes bloomed in the blue sky over the Pacific. They had made it. They had turned a certain catastrophe into the finest hour of space exploration.
If the previous stories were about surviving nature's sudden fury, the construction of the Panama Canal was a war. It was not a battle of hours or days, but a 10-year siege against the jungle, the mosquito, and the very geology of the Earth. It remains the greatest engineering feat in American history,
but the price tag was written in blood. The dream was simple: connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Before the canal, a ship traveling from New York to San Francisco had to sail all the way around the tip of South America, a perilous 13,000-mile journey that took months. A canal through the narrow Isthmus of Panama would cut that trip to just 5,000 miles. The French had tried first in the 1880s, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who built the Suez Canal. They failed spectacularly. They didn't just fail, they were annihilated. The jungle swallowed their machines, and yellow fever killed over 20,000 French workers. They left behind rusting excavators and a graveyard of ambition. In 1904, the United States, under the bullish presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, picked up the gauntlet. "Make the dirt fly," Roosevelt commanded. He viewed the canal as vital for American naval power. But when the Americans arrived in Panama, they found a hellscape. It was a place of relentless rain, mud that had the consistency of glue, and a stifling heat that could boil a man's brain. But the true enemy was invisible. In the early 20th century, most people still believed that diseases like malaria and yellow fever were caused by miasma, bad air rising from rotting vegetation, and swamp gas. But one man, Dr. William Gorgas, an army physician, believed in a radical new theory: mosquitoes. Gorgas told the chief engineer that if they wanted to build the canal, they first had to kill the mosquitoes. The politicians in Washington laughed at him. They didn't want to spend money chasing bugs. They wanted to dig dirt. But without Gorgas, the canal would have failed, just like the French attempt. Gorgas launched a military-style campaign against the insect. It was total war. He organized fumigation brigades that went house to house in Panama City and Cologne. They drained swamps. They cut down acres of brush. They poured oil on every puddle of standing water to suffocate the larvae. They even put buckets of water under the legs of hospital beds to stop ants, only to realize mosquitoes were breeding in the buckets, so they oiled those too. It worked. Yellow fever was eradicated from the canal zone. Malaria rates plummeted. It was one of the greatest triumphs of public health in history. With the workers no longer dying like flies, the real digging could begin. The challenge was the Culebra Cut. This was the spine of the continent, the Continental Divide. To get water to flow between the oceans, the engineers had to slice through a mountain range. It was 9 miles of solid rock and unstable shale. The men who worked in the cut called it Hell's Gorge. The temperature at the bottom of the pit could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise was deafening, a constant symphony of steam shovels, rock drills, and dynamite blasts. The steam shovels were monsters, 95-ton machines that could lift tons of rock in a single scoop. The Americans built a massive railway system to haul the dirt away, a logistical masterpiece that functioned like a conveyor belt. But the earth fought back. The geology of the Culebra Cut was treacherous. The rock was slippery. When they dug deep, the pressure would cause the sides of the cut to slide in. These weren't small landslides. They were avalanches of mud and rock that could bury a train engine and its crew in seconds. A worker would arrive in the morning to find that the track he had laid the day before was twisted and buried under 20 feet of dirt. It's like digging in a bucket of eels, one engineer complained. They would dig out the slide, only for it to slide again a week later. It was a Sisyphean task. Dynamite was the tool of choice, but it was volatile. In the tropical heat, the dynamite could become unstable. Accidental explosions were common. Men were blown apart, were crushed by falling rock. One Spanish worker, struggling to describe the danger, wrote home, "There is not enough room for the crosses." Over 5,600 workers died during the American phase of construction. Most were West Indian laborers from Barbados and Jamaica. They did the hardest work for the least pay. They were paid in Panamanian silver, while the white American skilled workers were paid in gold. This gold and silver roll system was a stain on the project, a rigid caste system in the middle of the jungle. Despite the death in the mud, the work progressed. The scale was hard to comprehend. They moved enough earth to build a Great Wall of China from San Francisco to New York City. They built the Gatun Dam, creating the largest man-made lake in the world at the time, to lift the ships over the mountains. The locks were the crowning glory. These were massive concrete chambers, 1,000 feet long, powered by electricity, a novelty at the time. The gates were so perfectly balanced that a single 40-horsepower motor could open them. The water moved by gravity alone, a system of culverts as wide as train tunnels that could fill a lock chamber in 8 minutes. On August 15, 1914, the steamship SS Ancon made the first official transit. It sailed from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The dream was real. The oceans were joined. But the celebration was muted. World War I had erupted in Europe just days before. The world's attention was on the trenches of France, not the jungles of Panama. The greatest engineering feat of the century was unveiled to a distracted world. Yet the canal changed everything. It transformed global trade. It cemented the United States as a global superpower, and it proved that American industrial might could literally move mountains. But for the men who dug it, the memory wasn't of glory. It was of the mud, the heat, the roar of the dynamite, and the ghostly hum of the mosquitoes that Dr. Gorgas had fought so hard to silence. While the Panama Canal was a triumph of engineering, the Johnstown flood of 1889 was a catastrophic failure of it, and a chilling example of the negligence of the rich destroying the lives of the poor. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, was a booming steel town. It sat in a valley at the confluence of the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers. It was a town of smoke and fire, where Welsh and German immigrants worked 12-hour shifts in the ironworks. 14 miles up the river, high in the mountains, sat a playground for the elite. It was the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Its members were the titans of American industry: Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon. They wanted a private lake for their summer cottages. To create this lake, they modified an old earthen dam, but they did it cheaply. They lowered the dam to make the road across it wide enough for their carriages. They put screens across the spillway to keep the fish from escaping, screens that would fatally clog with debris. They removed the discharge pipes that allowed the water level to be lowered in an emergency. The club's engineers warned them the dam was unsafe. The rich men ignored them. They just wanted to fish. On May 31, 1889, a massive storm hit the region. It rained like never before. The lake, Lake Conemaugh, began to rise. The club manager, realizing the danger, tried frantically to dig a new spillway, but it was too late. The water was cresting the top. At 3:10 p.m., the dam gave way. 20 million tons of water were unleashed. It wasn't just water, it was a wall of destruction. As the water roared down the narrow valley, it scoured the earth. It picked up trees, rocks, houses, and barns. It picked up a barbed wire factory, tangling miles of wire into the crushing mass. It picked up a train. By the time the wave reached Johnstown, 14 miles away, it was 40 feet high and traveling at 40 miles per hour. It was no longer liquid. It was a rolling mountain of debris. It contained 33 locomotives, hundreds of houses, and thousands of people. The residents of Johnstown heard a roar that sounded like a lot of steam whistles blowing at once. Then the mountain fell on them. The devastation was absolute. The waves smashed the town against the stone bridge of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The debris piled up against the arches of the bridge, creating a tangled dam of wood, steel, and bodies. Then the pile caught fire. Oil from overturned tank cars soaked the debris. People who had survived the drowning, who were trapped in the wreckage of their homes pressed against the bridge, were now burned alive. It was a scene from hell. Survivors reported hearing the screams of the trapped turning into hymns as they realized no rescue was coming before the flames consumed them. 2,209 people died. Entire families were wiped out. One survivor, Victor Heiser, rode the roof of his barn like a surfboard through the flood, dodging crashing houses. He would later become a famous doctor, but he never forgot the sound of the dam breaking. The Johnstown flood was the first major disaster where the newly formed American Red Cross, led by Clara Barton, arrived to help. Barton, then 67 years old, stayed for 5 months. It was the moment the Red Cross became an American institution. The legal aftermath was bitter. The survivors sued the club members, but the courts, dominated by the interests of the wealthy, ruled the flood was an act of God. The titans of industry paid nothing, not a single dollar. It remains one of the most glaring injustices in the history of American law, a stark reminder of a time when money could buy immunity from even mass manslaughter.
If Johnstown was a disaster of water and the Donner Party a disaster of snow, the death of San Francisco was a disaster of fire and earth. It is the story of the first modern American city to be completely erased in peacetime, a catastrophe that unfolded with the speed of a movie reel and the violence of a war. On the night of April 17, 1906, San Francisco was the Paris of the West. It was the jewel of the Pacific, a city of gold rush tycoons, steep hills, cable cars, and the bawdy, dangerous Barbary Coast. That night, the Grand Opera House was packed. The legendary tenor Enrico Caruso had just performed in Carmen. After the show, the elite dined on oysters and champagne at the Palace Hotel, unaware that they were toasting a city that would not exist in the morning. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, the earth woke up. It began with a heavy silence, described by survivors as a sudden drop in air pressure. Then came a rumble, like a train passing underneath the floorboards. Then came the jolt. The San Andreas Fault, which runs like a scar through California, slipped. The rupture tore for 296 miles. In the city, the ground didn't just shake, it rolled. Survivors described the streets rising and falling in waves like the swell of the ocean. Cobblestones popped out of the ground like bullets. Chimneys snapped off and crashed through roofs, crushing people in their beds. The City Hall, a masterpiece of architecture that had taken 20 years to build, shook so violently that its massive dome was left standing on a skeleton of steel, the stone walls falling away like a shedding skin. Enrico Caruso, the opera star, woke up in his suite at the Palace Hotel. He ran to the window and saw the city dancing. He packed his bags, walked out into the street, and swore he would never return to San Francisco. He kept his word. The shaking lasted only 45 to 60 seconds. When it stopped, the silence returned. But it was quickly broken by the screams of the trapped and the sound of bells. Church bells, shaken by the quake, were ringing wildly in the steeples. The earthquake did terrible damage, but it was not the killer. The killer was the infrastructure. Underneath the streets, two vital networks ran side by side, the gas mains and the water mains. The earthquake snapped them both. The gas lines ruptured, spewing highly flammable fuel into the basements of collapsed buildings. The water lines shattered, draining the city's reservoirs into the dirt. Fires broke out instantly. One famous fire started in a house on Hayes Street, where a woman named Alice, unaware of the gas leak, tried to cook breakfast. It became known as the Ham and Eggs Fire.
Within minutes, there were 50 separate fires burning across the city. The fire department, led by the tragically ill Chief Dennis Sullivan, who was mortally wounded in the quake when a chimney crushed his room, rushed to the hydrants. They hooked up their hoses. They turned the valves. Nothing happened. A trickle of mud, then dry air. "There's no water!" the cry went up. "The mains are broken!" The firefighters were helpless. They stood before towering infernos with empty hoses. The 50 fires began to merge. They grew into a firestorm, a phenomenon where the fire creates its own weather system, sucking in oxygen and generating winds that can knock a man down. The temperature at the center of the blaze reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel beams in skyscrapers didn't just bend, they melted and dripped like candle wax. Brigadier General Frederick Funston, the commander at the Presidio Army Base, made a fateful decision. Without declaring martial law, which he had no authority to do, he marched his troops into the city. He decided that if they couldn't fight the fire with water, they would fight it with explosives. They would create fire breaks, blowing up buildings in the path of the fire to starve it of fuel. It was a desperate military tactic, but it went horribly wrong. The soldiers were not trained in demolition. They used black powder and dynamite. Instead of collapsing buildings neatly, they often blew flaming debris into untouched neighborhoods, setting them on fire. In the confusion, they blew up liquor stores and drug stores, where the alcohol exploded and accelerated the flames. The remedy was helping to burn the city down. Chaos reigned in the streets. There was a rumor that the Bank of Italia, which would later become Bank of America, was going to burn. The founder, Amedeo Giannini, fearing his depositors' money would be lost, hid the bank's gold and cash under crates of vegetables in a garbage wagon. He drove it past the looters and soldiers to his home in the suburbs, saving the fortune that would later help rebuild the city. Looting began. The mayor, Eugene Schmitz, issued a proclamation. The federal troops, the members of the regular police force, and all special police officers have been authorized to kill, by my orders, any and all persons found engaged in looting or in the commission of any other crime. It was the Wild West. Soldiers shot men on sight. One man was reportedly bayoneted for trying to take a bottle of whiskey from a shattered window. Another was shot for trying to retrieve a chicken from the ruins. The fire burned for 3 days. It consumed 500 city blocks. The Palace Hotel, the symbol of the city's luxury, gutted by flames, stood like a tombstone. On the waterfront, thousands of refugees gathered at the ferry building, the only escape route. Rich women in fur coats sat on their steamer trunks next to Chinese laborers who had lost everything. They watched the hills of their city glow red in the night. When the smoke finally cleared, San Francisco was a moonscape. 28,000 buildings were destroyed. Over 3,000 people were dead, though the official count was falsified to 375 for years to protect the city's reputation and real estate value. But the spirit of the city was unbreakable. Even while the ashes were still hot, a sign appeared on a pile of bricks on Market Street. "Don't talk about the earthquake, talk about the coming city." And they did. They rebuilt San Francisco with a speed that startled the world. But the 1906 earthquake remains a scar on the American psyche, a reminder that the solid earth beneath our feet is only a temporary platform. 30 years later, the disaster was not sudden. It did not strike in a minute like the quake, or a day like the flood. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation that lasted a decade. It was the Dust Bowl, the greatest ecological disaster in American history. It happened in the southern plains, the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. This was the land of the Great Plow-Up. During World War I, wheat prices had skyrocketed. The government told farmers, "Plant more wheat, we'll win the war." Farmers looked at the endless grasslands and saw gold. They brought in tractors and plowed up the native buffalo grass that had held the soil together for thousands of years. They turned millions of acres of prairie into bare dirt. For a while it worked. The rain fell, the wheat grew, and people got rich. Then, in 1931, the rain stopped. The drought was biblical. The sun baked the exposed soil into a fine powder, and then the winds came. Without the grass to anchor it, the soil simply lifted into the air. It wasn't just dust, it was the land itself getting up and leaving. The storms were called black blizzards. They were terrifying monsters, walls of black earth 10,000 feet high, moving at 60 miles an hour. When they hit, they blotted out the sun completely. Noon turned to midnight instantly. Chickens went to roost, thinking it was night. People in their houses couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The most infamous storm struck on April 14, 1935, a day forever known as Black Sunday. It was a clear, beautiful Sunday afternoon. People were coming home from church. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Birds began to chatter nervously and fly away. A massive, roiling black cloud appeared on the northern horizon, stretching as far as the eye could see. It looked like a tidal wave of earth. Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, was there in Pampa, Texas. He watched the wall of dust hit. He thought it was the end of the world. He wrote a song about it, "So Long It's Been Good to Know Ya." He literally thought he was saying goodbye to civilization. The dust was everywhere. It wasn't just outside, it was inside. It seeped through the cracks around windows and doors. Housewives would hang wet sheets over the windows to catch the dust. By morning, the sheets would be heavy with mud. At the dinner table, plates were kept upside down until the moment the food was served. You ate dust, you drank dust, and you breathed it. A new plague appeared, dust pneumonia. It killed the young and the old. Children died with their lungs coated in mud. Doctors would open up the lungs of the dead and find them heavy and black. People wore masks made of gauze or handkerchiefs soaked in kerosene, but nothing stopped the fine silt. Nature went mad. With the ecosystem destroyed, plagues of insects descended. First came the centipedes and spiders invading homes to escape the heat. Then came the jackrabbits, millions of them. They came out of the hills starving, eating everything in their path, fence posts, clothes on the line, the siding off houses. The farmers, desperate and horrified, organized rabbit drives. They herded the rabbits into pens and clubbed them to death by the thousands. It was a brutal, bloody business, but it was a war for survival. Then came the static electricity. The dust in the air created so much static charge that barbed wire fences glowed blue at night with St. Elmo's fire. If you shook hands with someone, the spark could knock you down. Cars stalled because the static shorted out the ignition systems. To stop their cars, people had to drag chains behind them to ground the vehicle. The psychological toll was immense. This wasn't just a weather event, it was a betrayal. The land, which was supposed to provide, was killing them. Men who prided themselves on being providers watched their crops wither year after year. They shot their starving cattle because they couldn't feed them. The suicide rate climbed. Finally, the people broke. They packed up their jalopies, old Fords and Chevys, tied mattresses to the roof, and headed west. They followed Route 66. They were the Okies, though they came from many states. They were refugees in their own country. They dreamed of California, a land of milk and honey, orange groves and jobs. But when they arrived, they didn't find a welcome mat. They found police blockades at the state border. "Go back," the officers said. "We don't want you." They were herded into migrant camps, living in tents and shacks made of cardboard. They were despised by the locals, called trash. They worked in the fields for starvation wages, picking peaches and cotton. The Dust Bowl didn't end until the rain returned in 1939, and the government under FDR established the Soil Conservation Service to teach farmers how to farm without destroying the land. They planted millions of trees, shelter belts to break the wind. The land eventually healed, but the scars remained. The Dust Bowl was a lesson written in dirt. If you break the laws of nature, nature will break you.
We began this journey on the frozen ice of the Weddell Sea, where 28 men waited for a ship that would never return. We end it on the concrete island of Manhattan, where 500,000 people waited for ships they never expected to see. The morning of September 11, 2001, was defined by its sky, a brilliant, cloudless cobalt blue. It was the kind of weather pilots call severe clear. In New York City, the rhythm of the morning rush was beating at its peak. Subways were full, coffee shops were busy. Then, at 8:46 a.m., the rhythm stopped. When the first plane hit the North Tower, the confusion was absolute. When the second plane hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., the confusion turned to a cold, hard realization: the city was under attack. As the towers burned, the authorities made a decision that had not been made in modern history. They locked down the island. The bridges and tunnels were closed to all traffic except emergency vehicles. The subways were shut down. Manhattan is, geographically, a sliver of rock surrounded by water. When the exits closed, Lower Manhattan became a cage. Then the unthinkable happened. The South Tower collapsed. A cloud of pulverized concrete, glass, and steel, echoing the pyroclastic flow of Mount St. Helens and the black blizzards of the Dust Bowl, roared through the canyons of the financial district. It chased people down the streets. Thousands of terrified civilians ran south. They ran away from the fire, away from the falling buildings, until they ran out of land. They hit the water. By mid-morning, a massive crowd had gathered at the seawalls of Battery Park and the Hudson River piers. It was a scene of biblical desperation. Businessmen in expensive suits covered in gray ash, women holding babies, construction workers, tourists, all pressed against the railings. To their back was a wall of smoke and death. To their front was the harbor. They were trapped. There was no evacuation plan for this. The Coast Guard was overwhelmed. They had a few boats, but not enough to move a population the size of a medium city. At 10 a.m., the North Tower fell. The dust cloud grew thicker. The panic at the water's edge intensified. Some people, in their desperation, considered jumping into the Hudson River to swim to New Jersey, a dangerous feat in the strong currents. Then, on the radio, Channel 16, the emergency frequency for mariners, a voice crackled. It was Lieutenant Michael Day of the U.S. Coast Guard. He realized he couldn't do this alone. He looked at the radar, he looked at the harbor, and he made a call that changed history. All available boats. This is the United States Coast Guard. Anyone wanting to help with the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, report to Governor's Island. It was a plea to the civilian fleet, and the response was instant. From every corner of the harbor they came. The horizon suddenly filled with white wakes. It wasn't just official vessels. It was tugboats, ferries, private yachts, fishing trawlers, sightseeing boats, and tiny rubber dinghies. The captains didn't ask for permission. They just turned their wheels toward the smoke. Vincent Ardolino, captain of the Amberjack 5, a party fishing boat, heard the call. His wife told him not to go, that it was too dangerous, that there might be more attacks. Ardolino looked at the burning city and said, "I have to go. There are people there." He throttled up. When the boats arrived at the seawall, the scene was chaotic. The smoke was so thick the captains couldn't see the pier until they hit it. They used their radar to navigate the blindness. The Amberjack 5 pulled up.
Ardolino shouted, "Get on! Anyone who wants to live, get on!" People began to jump. They jumped from the high seawalls onto the decks of tugboats. They passed babies down, bucket brigade style. It was a Dunkirk moment. In 1940, during World War II, the British civilian fleet rescued 339,000 soldiers from the beaches of France over the course of 9 days. On September 11, 2001, this ragtag American fleet of tugs and ferries rescued nearly 500,000 people in just 9 hours. It was the largest maritime rescue in human history. The captains didn't care about money. They didn't care about liability. They burned out their engines. They scraped their paint against the concrete walls. Tugboat captains used their bows to gently nudge ferries into the docks to load faster. They sprayed water on the dust-covered survivors to wash the asbestos from their eyes. On the New Jersey side of the river, as the boats unloaded the traumatized refugees, the citizens there were waiting. They had set up decontamination showers with garden hoses. Ophthalmologists were waiting on the docks to flush eyes. Strangers hugged strangers. One tugboat captain later recalled, "I looked back at the city. It was burning. The skyline was gone. But then I looked at my boat, and I looked at the harbor. It was full of boats. And I realized the buildings are gone, but the people are still here. We are still here." The great boat lift of 9/11 is a story that is often overshadowed by the tragedy of the day, but it stands as the ultimate counterpoint to the terrorism. The terrorists believed that by striking the towers, they would shatter the American spirit, that panic would turn people against each other. Instead, the exact opposite happened. When the city broke, the people became the glue.
We have traveled through ice, fire, water, wind, and void. We have walked with Shackleton across the frozen Weddell Sea. We have starved with the Donners in the snow. We have drifted with the sailors of the Indianapolis in the shark-darkened Pacific. We have flown on the crippled wings of Apollo 13. We have seen San Francisco burn, Tulsa destroyed by hate, and the Twin Towers fall. This 15,000-word journey through history is not just a collection of disasters. It is a mosaic of the human condition. If there is a single thread that ties the frozen beard of Tom Crean in 1915 to the ash-covered face of a New York office worker in 2001, it is the refusal to accept the end. The endurance taught us that leadership is about optimism in the face of hopelessness. The Donner Party taught us the terrifying fragility of civilization. The Apollo 13 mission taught us that ingenuity can solve the unsolvable. The Dust Bowl taught us that we must respect the earth. The boat lift of 9/11 taught us that when the government cannot save you, your neighbor will. History is often taught as a list of wars and dates, but the real history, the one that matters, is the history of survival. It is the story of the mechanic on the James Caird sealing the boat with blood. It is the story of the engineer in Houston taping together a cardboard air filter. It is the story of the tugboat captain turning his vessel toward the smoke. These stories remind us that we are the descendants of survivors. The blood that runs in our veins is the blood of people who didn't quit. Whether facing the crushing pressure of the ice, the vacuum of space, or the collapse of a skyscraper, the response has always been the same. We look at the wreckage, we grieve for what is lost, and then we pick up a tool. We find a boat. We start walking. As Shackleton said when his ship sank beneath the ice, "So now we'll go home." And so we do.